Well, thank you very much, Gordon, for that introduction. And a special thanks to the program committee that allowed me to speak here today without even applying the litmus test. Now, there's a word from out of the old chemistry vocabulary. We use litmus paper, you know, to see whether the substance is acid or basic. But now the litmus test is what's used on candidates for public office to see what side of the fence they happen to be on. I stole the topic of this talk from the 1966 movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, that starred Clint Eastwood in one of his early roles. Actually, it was number 15 out of 75. And I don't know whether you could hear the music that was being played as you came in, but that was Yo-Yo Ma playing the background music for the screen for that particular movie. And also that title was chosen because it really describes my take on science today. Now, the good describes all the things that have been done in these last 70 years or so to improve our way of life due to scientific discoveries. The bad, those are the accidents that happen. And then the ugly are the trends that I see coming around in science that are particularly disturbing at this time. Now, this talk could easily have been entitled, "This 90-year-old codger." He shoots off about the good old days, how the world is going to pot. And that's what codgers do all the way down through history. But like everyone else, I come in here with a set of biases, and these have also been affected by my 25 years of experience in the Oakmont phalanx. And those who heard Larry Levenger's talk on Steinbeck remember what the Oakmont phalanx happens to be. Now, in the view of many, I come in with 4 strikes against me giving this particular talk. I grew up in the Midwest. I served in the military. I worked as a chemist, and I worked for a large corporate oil company. And so many of my biases aren't shared by the public in general, or even maybe by Oakmonters in general, or even by my own family. But a word about biases. That's the scientists say the really way to face problems which we're facing today is to use critical thinking. Take a look at both sides of an argument. What is the evidence? What are the proponents and the opponents? What is their background? How can they have any science which they're presenting? And then apply this and decide, do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages when you apply critical thinking? However, there are some subjects that really are not subject to critical thinking. One of them is religion, and one of them is politics. And so I'm going to try not to speak on either of those subjects today. However, I realize that there are many of the subjects that I'm talking about today that many feel with almost a religious fervor on their feeling. Now, to set the stage for this talk, I'd like to set up a straw man, or let's call it a straw woman. This is an 18-year-old high school senior. It may be your grandson or your granddaughter, and they're enrolled in a chemistry class today. Then in 2083, this straw person is going to be giving a talk to the Oakmont Sunday Symposium, assuming that the symposium in Oakmont are still there, and be talking science. Now, this straw person will be able to look back at 2013 and see these problems that we're facing today, and from that perspective, which of these were just a mere blip that disappeared shortly, or was it the beginning of a trend which could only spread. And right now, from our point of view, it's really hard to tell which of these things are going to happen. Well, here's a quick summary of my background. I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, graduated from Topeka High School, which I think was the most beautiful high school in the whole world. Went to the University of Kansas then as a chemistry major. And in 1942, I joined the Navy B-12 program in order to escape the draft, and had a semester at Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. And here are the Swabbies in front of the men's building at Oberlin, Ohio. Now, Oberlin did have a rich chemistry background. Back in 1885, Charles Hall, he was a student at Oberlin in chemistry, and he invented the Hall process for making aluminum. He did that in his garage. He became very rich, and he was one of the founders of Alcoa. And at Oberlin, they do have this aluminum statue there in Oberlin College. I got my commission at Midshipman School in Chicago, then spent 8 months in radar training at Harvard and MIT. And there's the Harvard boathouse. I stayed in Gore Hall, which is a short distance away. There were sculls out there on the Charles River that we could row, and so it was really quite a delightful experience. And then I served as radar officer for a division of destroyer escorts. We were escorting convoys across the Atlantic. DE here, we were anti-submarine, and so off the fantail here, we would roll off depth charges if we thought that there were submarines in the area. After the war then, I still had to spend some more time, and so I was radar officer for a light cruiser. This is the cruiser Fargo that I was on for about a year. We had whoops. Oh, yes. On the fantail, there, we had a couple of catapults, and so we had seaplanes that we could launch from the cruiser. And we had a delightful time. We were on a goodwill tour to Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo. Then we went to the Mediterranean, and there's the cruiser in the Grand Canal in Venice. In the background, you can see there's the Campanile that the UC Berkeley Campanile was copied after, there in St. Mark's Square. This was during the war, and there's still barbed wire there along the dock where we were tied up. And here we're leaving Venice. Some of the gondolas came out to see us off. Then we went back to Naples, and actually had a little chance to make a quick trip up to Rome, and actually had a audience with Pope Pius XII, who held audiences, public audiences for service personnel and the public in those days. And although my talk today is about chemistry, music has been a hobby all my life. You know, every ship in the Navy had an Este pump organ allotted to it for church services and burials at sea. And so on the destroyer escort, I had that pump organ, played it for church services, luckily never played it for any burials at sea. Once when I was tied up, when the ship was tied up in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, I had a chance to go to a performance of Phil Spitalny's Hour of Charm, all-girl orchestra. Remember that? Yeah. Evelyn and her magic violin. I had known one of the trumpet players here. She had been in a high school band camp that I was at, so I was able to visit her there in New York from the ship. And then this was my stateroom on the Fargo. We had a band on board since we had an admiral, and so I had that pump organ there in my stateroom. My roommate was a Marine. I was trying to teach him how to play the organ, but people complained so about that, I gave up on that particular project. Well, after leaving the Navy in '46, I returned to KU, got my bachelor's and master's degree at Kansas, came to Berkeley, got a PhD in '51. All this courtesy of the GI Bill. Didn't cost a cent. Can you imagine that? How times have changed when you think what a year at Berkeley now does cost. And in those days, chemists were in a big demand. I got a job as a research chemist for Chevron in Richmond at that time, and worked in the lab for 34 years and retired and moved to Oakmont in '86. I'd like to mention, though, about musicians and chemists. I once saw a help wanted ad for Eastman Chemical that said there was an opening for an organic chemist who could play the oboe. Now, the most famous chemist, musician, was Alexander Borodin, a Russian composer, and he was composer of that Tony Award-winning musical Kismet. He spent half of his time in the lab, half of the time composing. Another famous scientist, Albert Einstein, who played the violin. He once said that when he was working on a particularly tough physics problem, he would pick up the violin and play it for a while, and often the answer would come to him after doing that, and he could sit down and solve that problem. He was also a member of a string quartet, and one of the standard jokes was, "Albert, can't you count?" As an aside, though, Wally Shilp, an Oakmonter, his father was a philosophy professor at Northwestern and a friend of Einstein's. And Wally said that Einstein visited their home when he was a young boy. And speaking of famous chemists, I should mention the famous local chemist, that's Willard F. Libby. He grew up in Sebastopol, and in 1960 he got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for developing radiocarbon dating. And Route 116 out of Sebastopol is named the Willard F. Libby Memorial Highway in his memory. Well, one of my hobbies is publishing brass quintet arrangements, and one of my arrangements that was particularly popular was an original composition by a Stonebridge Road fellow musician, Dick Dennis, and the title of that composition was "Midnight on Stonebridge." How about that? And that's the score of Midnight on Stonebridge. Those that know Stonebridge Road at midnight say it should have been 32 bars of silence. Now, how did I become a chemist? Back in those early days, we had chemistry sets. All kinds of toxic chemicals that we could play with, and that was one way to get interested, as kids get interested in chemistry. Also, we used to make lead soldiers. You know, you'd put the lead on a can, put it on the stove, melt the lead, and then you could pour it into molds and make your own sand mold, or your own lead soldiers. There's a notice in the paper today that there's no safe limit of lead in the bloodstream, and so I hate to think what these lead fumes did to my brain in those days. Well, what were the laboratories like back in the 40s? They were really pretty dangerous, toxic places. I'll open with a cartoon. I don't know whether you can read that. Welcome to Chemistry 101, where we will safely study the elements of the earth. And it looks like they've had a few explosions in the lab. Actually, I did know a high school teacher that was missing one finger that he lost in a demonstration in the lab. Anyway, we had a hydrogen sulfide generator in the laboratory, and so the chemistry building could smell like rotten eggs for blocks around. Once we dumped some metallic sodium down the drain, and the explosion from that knocked the manhole cover off of the street next door. And weighing the materials was a challenge. Now, Jerry Foster used to teach qual and quantitative analysis. This is quant, Jerry.
I remember it.
And you remember those analytical balances. You put the sample on one tray here. There you put the sample on here and analytical weights on the other. You count the swings of the thing and able to measure then things that way. So it was time consuming but not all that dangerous. And here are some of the lab shots of me and my future wife Leslie at Berkeley. She was an undergraduate at that time doing some senior research. She wouldn't get by with this nowadays. She's not wearing eye protection, and right now you don't enter the lab without having eye protection. In those days I wore glasses, and so at least that covered me there. Those Leslie's doing distillation there. She also worked in the lab, the stockroom there in Old Chem. The students checked out the chemicals that they needed. There she's doing a hydrogenation test. I'm trying to see if that tank was actually strapped to the wall, and yes it is. That's good. And here I am probably pouring out some toxic chemicals into the test tube. You know, there was a survey not be long before this, is what is the health of chemists that are exposed to all these nasty things? What they found was that chemists in general were healthier than the general public. And what they attributed that to was they stopped smoking earlier. That made all the difference in the world because you couldn't smoke in the lab. And so they did, and so chemists really, as a group, have not been that unhealthy. Okay. But there were problems in the lab because, of course, we had diethyl ether around, very flammable. There were Bunsen burners around, and so fires were fairly common in the laboratory. And there I'm taking a melting point test in the Old Chem. All the lab tops were lead in those days, more exposure to lead, of course. And they're doing an experiment on a hot plate. Well, these photos show what the old labs were like in the old days. Now let's talk about the good. And what I'm going to do about that is how were these 50 years of technical expertise be shown to the whole world, and how better to do that than through world fairs. And so I decided world fairs are a good way to demonstrate what these advances were. So let's start way back in 1893. This is a Columbian Exposition World's Fair in Chicago. Electricity was the big deal in those days. It was the first World Fair to be lighted with electric lights. And here's the, this is the AC current exhibit there, which was a big deal in those days. See, this is only 1893, not that long ago that finally we went to alternating current. Now, St. Louis in 1904, that was the fair, of course, where we got the song, "Meet Me in St. Louis, Louis." That was Judy Garland's song from that World's Fair. And at this fair, the visitors enjoyed the first public air conditioning. And I lived in Kansas at that time, and my grandfather was a farmer. He traveled from Kansas to St. Louis for the fair. The furthest he'd ever been from the farm. He decided that travel wasn't for him, and he never traveled that far again. Now, let's go to 1915 locally. Here's the Pan-Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, down at the marina. And right here you can see here's the Palace of Fine Arts, which is the only survivor from that fair. One of the big events that took place at that fair was Alexander Graham Bell made a phone call to New York. That was the first transcontinental phone call that was made, and that was really a big deal in those days. Now, let's go to 1933. This is the Century of Progress fair in Chicago. You might recognize some of these things here. Here's Soldier Field. I think it looks a little bit different than that now. Off here, whoops, let's go back here. Let's go way back here. Okay, there we are. Let's see now, yeah, so we were right off to the right was the Stevens Hotel in Chicago. And at that time, that was the largest hotel in the world. I think maybe it's the Hilton now. Other things you can see in here, here's the Field Museum, the Hayden Planetarium. And our family went there from Kansas. We spent a great time at that fair, and that was really a big deal. There is even a pavilion here from automobiles. Here's the Studebaker Land Cruiser. You may recognize that particular vehicle. Of course, automobiles were really a big deal. Here's the Oldsmobile Straight 8 and the 6 for 1933. Of course, in those days, every year a new model would come out, and there'd be great expectations. What's going to be the type of automobile the next year? And there were a lot of these big pavilions that were featured automobile progress. There was even a Robert Ripley, believe it or not. Santa Rosa's Robert Ripley had a pavilion there. And I should mention that I belong to the Robert Ripley branch of CSRS Branch 53 here in Oakmont, so Robert Ripley's name is still maintained. Now let's go to 1939, San Francisco. How many were at that fair in San Francisco? Oh wow, how you remember that? Because it was built on Treasure Island, and Treasure Island was built just for the fair. This was just from sand that was scooped up out of the bay, and they built this island then so that that's where the fair could take place. After the war, they planned this was going to be an airport. Can you imagine that? But it was going to be for the China Clippers coming across from Pacific, and that was going to be an airport for them. Now I think maybe for commercially also. However, World War II came along, and Treasure Island then was taken over by the Navy, and it never did become an airport. And another view of the San Francisco airport there, or the fair in 1939. And up in lights, Sally Rand. She was down on the Midway. That was a big event there at that time. Okay, now Expo 67. This was in Montreal, Canada. We traveled there, our whole family. We camped in a campground not far from the fair, right along the river. And the big feature here was this huge geodesic dome. This was designed by Buckminster Fuller, and this is where the USA exhibit was held. And as a chemical side, they've recently found that there is a 60 carbon compound that's found in soot that has exactly this same kind of structure of the geodesic dome. And so compounds of this material are called buckyballs, into memory of Buckminster Fuller, who came up with that design of the geodesic dome. Okay, we're going from 67 to the next fair. One part of Expo 67 was this habitat, a new concept in housing, and actually Habitat I think is still in operation in Montreal. And I think that probably the sports facility I think has taken over the area where the fair took place back in 67. Now let's go to Expo 74 in Spokane, Washington. Did anybody attend that fair? Oh, there are some hands, okay. And this was a big deal in Spokane. Our reason for going there, that we had a son who was a music major at Oregon State, and the Oregon State Band was performing there in the pavilion. Of course, they have these two magnificent waterfalls right in the middle of the fair here, and this was developed from some of the lower industrial areas of Spokane when that fair was built. The theme of the fair was celebrating tomorrow's fresh new environment, and it was the first fair to have environmental theme. It also had the IMAX theater, which was the largest movie screen up till that time. Now let's go to 1982, Knoxville, Tennessee. Now that's sort of out of the way. Did anybody go to Knoxville? Well, Leslie and I did. Probably the few that did attend there. We weren't that impressed with that fair, but it did have this sun sphere, steel tower. President Ronald Reagan opened the fair, and touch screens, though for the first time were exposed, and we know what has happened to touch screens since then. Expo 86 in Vancouver, Canada. Did anybody go to Vancouver? There, oh, a lot of hands for that. That was really a great fair. We really enjoyed that. The theme was transportation and communications. It had a 360-degree movie screen, and then it had this SkyTrain, which was a completely automated monorail system. And after the fair, this was moved to England. Okay, Expo 88. We really had to travel because this fair was the last World's Fair in North America, the one there in Vancouver. So we go to Brisbane, Australia. The fair here was right across the river from the city. Leslie and I happened to be there as part of a month-long trip to Australia, and so we had a chance to visit the fair at that time. And Queen Elizabeth opened this fair with the theme Leisure in the Age of Technology. And the mascot was the Australian platypus. That was Expo Oz. And we actually saw a duck-billed platypus in the wild as part of our trip. Okay, in summary, I've used world fairs and examples of the displays of the discoveries of those years. Now, my own personal experience has been mentioned. I worked in petroleum products research for Chevron. I was particularly proud of one of my patents. It was for the grease for the moon rover. And it, as far as I know, worked fine, and it's probably still sitting up there on the moon. Not a very large market, but that was an interesting project. I don't think they sold very many gallons of grease. Well, in general, a whole lot of areas of expertise have taken place during these years. There are also a lot of analytical tests that we use, which now in the public domain. One of the examples is NMR. We called that nuclear magnetic resonance, and it was used to decide what was the structure of a molecule. Well, they found that that analytical tool could also be used on living tissues, and so the name was changed. It's now MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. They knew the public wouldn't go for a test that had nuclear in the title, and so MRI came right out of the old chemistry laboratory. Okay, well, those are some of the good things that I'd like to talk about. Now, what were the bad things? Now, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to call accidents as the bad things. These are in the universal vocabulary, bad accidents that have taken place. There was Bhopal in India, Chernobyl in the Ukraine, Seveso in Italy, 3 Mile Island in the United States, and then recently the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. And of course the Chevron fire recently, it's been in the news a lot and is still there. And it's too bad that these kind of things take place, but there was a particularly unfortunate accident that took place in the chemistry laboratory at UCLA in 2008. There was a researcher there, Sherry Sangley. She was transferring some pyrophoric chemical, had an accident, it caught fire, she received severe burns and died 18 days later. Now, her professor has been charged with violating labor codes, and that case is still in the court. But this event really shook up the academic community as what safety standards really should be in the laboratory, and so steps are now being taken to help prevent any of these kind of accidents in the future. Now, another subject of ugly is world fairs. Why would I put world fairs in ugly? Because they were such great things, enjoyable events. Well, the last World's Fair in the United States was New Orleans in 1984, 20 years ago. The last fair in North America was Vancouver in 1986. Well, one clue that an era was ending was really Expo 74 in Spokane, which had an environmental theme. The press said what we really should have said the theme of the fair should have been, "We've screwed up, now we're paying the price." Anyway, but overseas, fairs are still popular. Expo 2010 was held in Shanghai, had 73 million visitors. Expo 2012 was in Korea. Expo 2015 is proposed for Milan, Italy. So overseas, world fairs are still popular. Well, why did this come about? Well, one of the things, most of these previous world fairs were bankrolled by the big corporations. They wanted to show off their latest products to a consuming public. But those days are gone. Those products that they invented now are probably being manufactured overseas. And even more tragic, the large corporate research labs are gone. One of the most examples of that, which is really marvelously successful, was Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. It was there that the transistor was invented. Charge-coupled devices, which are in every one of our digital cameras, were invented there. No longer is there a Bell's Lab, yet across the board, corporations decided that these expensive research laboratories just didn't pay their way. Better to let other countries do the research. So let Germany, Japan, China, let them do the research, and we can then license anything that they come up if we'd like to take advantage of that. That's a sad, sad situation for science. Well, the next ugly thing is the miserable chemistry job situation. The economic turn down has really had a devastating effect on the chemistry job market. And this next slide, I missed this slide of some of the products that were developed during these 50 years that we can see every place in the lab, in the kitchen and so forth. And even down here, of course, we see CDs, DVDs made of polycarbonate resin, these others made of other polymers that were invented during that time. So anyway, this slide shows the unemployment situation of the United States average and of American Chemical Society members. The chemists do better than the general public, but still, these sites here of 4% unemployment among chemists is the highest that it's ever really been in history. Now, when I got my degree, there were lots of jobs available. You could go into academia, government, industry, and there are recruiters on all the campuses to interview the graduates, and everyone usually had several job offers. But how times have changed. You know, there was a letter from a mother recently to the editor of Chem and Engineering News, and she said that she'd encouraged her daughter to study chemistry and be a chemist, but now her daughter's out of a job. Did her mother do wrong by steering her into chemistry? Well, the reply was, today's graduate chemists just may not work as chemists. They may end up in other kinds of jobs, but that chemistry training is worthwhile, as it teaches the students how to think and they could be able to apply it wherever it is that they work. A recent example is Margaret Thatcher. She received her bachelor's degree in chemistry from Oxford. She worked as an industrial research chemist, developing emulsifiers for ice cream. And then she went into politics and got a job as British Prime Minister. And although the prospects for chemists these days are poor, there are other disciplines that are even in worse shape, such as those who are anthropology majors and so forth. However, the engineering and the computer science grads are really still doing pretty well. Well, what is this war on science that I'm talking about? I feel it's a trend that is sweeping the country, and it was highlighted by a recent article by Michael Shermer in the Skeptics column in Scientific America entitled "The Left's War on Science." He particularly decried the left's almost religious fervor over the purity and sanctity of air, water, and especially food, and denouncing GMOs, genetically modified organisms, which we've been doing by breeding and selection for 10,000 years. And of course, in fact, Luther Burbank, our famous local scientist, gained his fame by crossbreeding. Now let's talk about climate. Here's a touchy one. What's the current wisdom on science, on climate? Well, the Earth has been getting warmer since the start of the Industrial Revolution, largely because of man's burning of fossil fuels. This generates carbon dioxide, and that accumulates in the atmosphere and joins those greenhouse gases up there. And so we need to cut back on our carbon dioxide generation in order to prevent further devastation of the environment. And this next slide shows a plot. The jagged line there shows the temperature variations, and the other line shows the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this is what scientists use to substantiate the argument that it really is carbon dioxide. There are other greenhouse gases, but carbon dioxide is the one that's now highlighted nowadays, and that you can see how it is increased during that time. One of the things that this kind of plot never shows, it starts out down here at 280 parts per million, and up here is 360, so it's gone up about 100. However, for thousands of years, it was down around about the 280 mark and sort of held steady there in the atmosphere. And so now let's say, where do we get this carbon dioxide that we see in the atmosphere? You see the biggest ones. Here is electricity generation. That generates a lot of carbon dioxide. Transportation, automobile, aircraft, and so forth. Industry, residential, and so forth. And so this shows who's generating the carbon dioxide. And you would like to think that any time we want to do anything to help things, we would cut down on the amount of carbon dioxide that are being generated by these big ones. But that doesn't seem to be the way things are going. We are saying, we talk a good talk that we want to cut down carbon dioxide. The United Nations set up an environmental program in 1988, now that was quite a while ago, to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And then there was the 1997 Kyoto Protocol that was set up to reduce worldwide emissions to 1990 levels. Only the United States and Canada, we were the only developed countries that didn't sign that thing, and so we got a lot of flack overseas because the United States didn't sign up to the Kyoto Protocol. Well, what is California doing? It's on the forefront of the scientific revolution, and so the way it is handling this environmental factor, punish those large emitters by a cap and trade program or a carbon tax. Now this won't reduce carbon dioxide, but it will generate some funds. What are those funds going to be used for? $3.6 billion. Well, part of it's to be used for stimulating renewable energy sources, but the rest of it then goes to disadvantaged neighborhoods. And there was a big article in the Chronicle this year, what are these disadvantaged neighborhoods in the Bay Area? And it showed them parts in Richmond and so forth, most of them downwind of refineries. And of course, the big advantage for these communities, they're going to be getting a big chunk of dough. The disadvantage, say you're in the real estate business in one of those, or you want to open a new business, you want to do this in a disadvantaged area. This is one of the things that they're fighting right now in this whole business of cap and trade. There's about a 5-page article in this morning Chronicle on climate and all the politics, and it's a shame that politics has so much to do with a subject that really should have good science. The only thing you talk about is cap and trade, and then we need an energy policy, but no one really wants to face that. Politicians want to get reelected, and so there's mighty little science in this whole discussion of that. A lot of talk about the cap and trade and the carbon tax and so forth, and the fact that that's going on. But outside of California, cap and trade really hasn't had much success. The U.S. Congress considered this, but they voted it down. And then just this month, the European Union did. They don't really want to cut down on the amount of energy that's being generated by these things right here, electricity and transportation and so forth. So let's look again. You know, back there I showed the plot of the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It had a sharp increase, let's see, back here, there. About 1950, it took a turn up. Why in the world did that happen? Because we didn't have any big changes in energy being generated or any big science. And this is called that hockey stick curve, because you know it shows that big hockey stick turn, which is about 1950. What in the world happened in 1950? Well, I looked at all the different things that may have been related to this, and one plot jumps out, and that's this one. Look what happened in about 1950. This is the world population. It went along fairly steady, clear up until then. All of a sudden, particularly in the developing countries, population really exploded. Look what happened. We went from about 2 billion all the way up over to about 9 billion people. Now those people need energy to survive. How come they're surviving? Health is getting better. Infant mortality is getting better. Their standard of living is getting better. And they're living too long. And there's too many of them. Now, no one wants to face this. So we've got to talk about some other things, but I think the clue at really what our problem is, we need to have a standard of living for everyone that's able to live in a decent way of life. However, about population, we do see once in a while some hope in this area. I'm always suspicious of plots which extrapolate all up and down and then take a turn in the future. They're now talking about maybe population will do that. That these developing countries in particular won't have to have that many babies, and so maybe this is not going to continue in the future. We have to talk to our straw man when he gives that talk on what's happened. We'll see what happens to population then. Okay, so let's take a look at the economics. Here are the various sources of energy that we have. Unfortunately, or fortunately, coal is the cheapest. It's also the least efficient and gives more pollutants than any of the other sources. Yet there's a big chunk of this country whose whole economy is based on coal, so it's going to be around for a long time. China is in the same business, that they have lots of coal and they're still expanding there. Gas, that's quite inexpensive, and probably it's gone down because as a result of fracking, they're finding all kinds of natural gas which for generation is a neat one to have. That has very few components, but it does generate carbon dioxide. But as that price goes down, believe it or not, we're now getting almost energy independent as far as the amount of oil that we need to increase from foreign countries. So that has made a big change in our supply of fossil fuels. And you see gases here. Let's go back. Ooh, dear. There. Give you a sneak preview of what's coming. Anyway, here's gas. Nuclear, that's really pretty economical if you can afford to build a plant. And when I was preparing for this talk, I looked up some stuff on nuclear because you don't hear anything about it here other than it's bad. But here are some statistics. There are 430 nuclear power plants in the world, and they're in 31 countries. This is surprising to me. And there are 68 new nuclear plants under construction worldwide. We don't hear about that. And of course, nothing like that is happening in this country. We have no new nuclear power plants being formed here, and nuclear is a bad word here. Now we go to the renewable resources. Here's wind. It's probably one of the most economical. Geothermal, of course, from the geysers. We get geothermal there. Biomass is a little more expensive. Solar, that's the most expensive. There's two kinds of solar. This one, you know, down in the desert, they have all of these mirrors and the absorbers and so forth. They heat a fluid which can then turn turbines and generate electricity just by the heat of the sun. And then we have the photovoltaic cells, which are the most expensive of all, but that's the one we hear about mostly and what we are talking about, and then for consumers and for generation of solar energy in general. The problem you can see is economic. Having renewable sources, all of these are more expensive. Well, what we hear, though, in support of the renewables is that we're running out of fossil fuels. That price is going to go up, and these prices for the renewables is going to go down. And so they think that the fossil fuel is running out. Well, the evidence, I think, is against that. Most oil companies are finding just about as much oil each year as they use, and they predict that at the current rates of production and exploration, that there's at least 100 years supply. Now, I've been hearing that we're running out of oil my entire life working for the oil company, and it's still going to continue, but you see, it's not going to be in our lifetime that we're going to run out of petroleum. Now, clean energy. Here's a hot subject. It's recently been introduced in Oakmont, and there were articles pro and con on clean energy each day in the newspapers. And now what they define as clean energy are solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass. Those are the clean. The others, I'll call them unclean, include hydroelectric, nuclear, fossil fuels. I'm surprised by hydroelectric that that's unclean because it doesn't generate any carbon dioxide. And I grew up at a time when we really thought dams were great. You know, they provide electricity, flood control, recreational uses. But the fishes don't have that point of view, and that's the popular feeling today. And the news that there were 4 hydroelectric dams on the Klamath River that they're talking about removing. You read those articles, it never mentions anywhere that, by the way, these dams are generating electricity. But there was great rejoicing that these dams were going to be removed. Now, the proponents of clean energy, as I've said, say if we sign up, and this is still in the works among the politicians, that our gas and electric bills will go down. Now, that's a very persuasive argument. That would carry a lot. Now, let's talk about the food industry. This is one of my chief anti-science culprits. For years, preservatives, for instance, were added to our food as antioxidant to prevent spoilage and rotting and so forth. But these preservatives were man-made chemicals, so the food industry decided to take them out. And they can then brag by saying that their food contains no preservatives. And I guess if you want to have antioxidants in your diet, you can get those from a health food store. But anyway, they say contains no preservatives is a big deal. This is my favorite apple bread. I love it. But look at this, what it says on here. No preservatives, no additives, no chemicals. I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I see that. Of course, there's a little item up here at the top. It does happen to have some salt and some baking soda and some baking powder. But you wonder, I could give a whole lecture of what is the implication of science, or as in general, people, when our kids, they're the ones that are going to be running things, what are they going to feel about this kind of a sign that says no chemicals? Oh dear, dear, dear. So there is another cartoon here. It's an interesting book. This was written by a chemistry professor at Stanford, James Coleman, and it's called Naturally Dangerous. And it goes through all of the bad things which are naturally grown, which have all these bad health effects that we read about that are now being applied also to man-made chemicals, but they're treated differently. And of course, here we have the wicked witch talking to Hansel and Gretel. She said, of course, and talking about the candy house, of course it's safe. It has no preservatives, no additives, no artificial coloring. Okay, and let's see. There was a delightful lecture here at the symposium by Yvonne Horn a couple weeks ago, which highlighted some of the natural toxic plants that she had seen in poison gardens that she had visited around the world. So that's the business of natural and unnatural from my point of view. Now how about the Green Revolution? It has a lot of worthwhile objectives, but it has a lot of anti-science objectives, and those are the ones that are a bother. Now in my mind, it's sort of a reincarnation of the hippie movement of the 70s. Back then it was the same way. Desire to turn back the clock, return to a natural world without man-made chemicals. And over time that appeal has spread. Now those little hippie health food stores of the 60s are large-scale, profitable businesses. I should mention Rachel Carson. Back in 1962, she wrote a book called Silent Spring, and there she decried the long-term effects of misusing pesticides. She particularly objected to the widespread spraying of DDT, and later it was banned. And although Rachel Carson died just 2 years after that book was published, she's credited with really kick-starting the Green Revolution. However, one of her quotes is really of interest. She said, "We must have insect control. I don't favor turning nature over to insects. I favor the sparing, selective, and intelligent use of chemicals, and it's the indiscriminate blanket spraying that I oppose." Now, in spite of that, the chemical profession didn't treat her very kindly. But they've had second thoughts, because she really had some good things to say about the misuse of chemicals. And so recently that book was designated a National Historic Chemical Landmark by the American Chemical Society. Well, there are a bunch of other hot topics that I could talk about, and I'm looking at the clock. Each one of these could be very time-consuming. We know all about them. Let's see which one we want to talk about. I would mention one. That's BPA. We read about that in the news all the time. This is currently in the news because it is an endocrine disruptor, and The problem, however, is that it's one of the major ingredients of two of our most widely used plastics, polycarbonate resins and epoxy resins. And those have been in use for 40 or 50 years. Now, polycarbonate is one of my favorite resins, as it's the material that my French horn mouthpiece is made out of. And here's a slide of the horn section. Well, here are these hot topics that I'm going to skip. Maybe we'll go through those quickly. And in the question and answer period, I've got stuff on all of these if you would like to discuss them. And everybody has some feeling about each one of these. Are you in favor or against it? And you can, each one of these is being highlighted in the current press. Well, anyway, here's the horn section of the New Horizons band last year. Not young, but you see 2 out of the 3 mouthpieces were made of polycarbonate, and it is an elderly group. I was a youngster in the group. This is Hattie. She was 94, and Roger, he was 91 at that time. Of course, I'll sneak in one more slide, that you're never too old to play the French horn. Now, I didn't want to talk about all these ugly things going on without saying something about the good news. And in spite of all that stuff that we've been reading, there are 3 plots that I would like to show. Here's one of them. Cancer deaths are going down. You don't really hear about that. All we hear about are the carcinogenic materials that we're being exposed to. Yet cancer is going down, both for men and for women. Here's infant mortality. And this is in the United States, and this is even more widespread in the undeveloped countries. As I mentioned before, that large increase in the population. Infant mortality is going down. You see, and it's been continuing to go down. Life expectancy, it's going up. Look, and just since 1960, it's gone up from 70 to almost 80. And you know, they say that 50% of the girl babies born this year will live to be 100. Think about that. And then there was a news that at least one of those girl babies is going to be living till 150. Of course, the last 50 years are probably in a rest home. Gaga. But life expectancy is going up. So there is some good news. We are making some progress. So now let's look at that straw man we were talking about in 2083. They'll look back at all these problems. Which one of them disappeared? Which of them expanded? How are we going to look at it in those days? Well, George McKinney gave a talk a couple of weeks ago about some of the marvelous things that are going to be happening down the road. How about this for a scenario? Our straw man may have a chip embedded in his brain, and by tapping his temple, he can instantly access all of the world's knowledge. How about that? That's something that may be going on. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for your attention, and I appreciate your discussion of any of these topics in the question and answer period. Thank you very much.